Welcome. Today we're going to talk about the Treaty of Versailles, or the formal agreement between all of the member countries to the terms of peace after World War I. Last class you ended with the Armistice Day, which was in November of 1918. It's going to take between 9 and 10 months to get to, well, a little bit less than that. It's going to take some time until like spring or summer of 1919 in order for the countries to come to an agreement on what a post-war world is going to look like. So, President Woodrow Wilson was one of the leaders of the group at the Paris Peace Conference, or the conference where they came up with the terms of peace. President Woodrow Wilson is going to have kind of worked ahead, and even before the United States was part of World War I, he was working on this document, which was called the 14 Points. And it was his plan for peace. It was what he thought the world should look like after World War I was complete. Remember, World War I was supposed to be, and it was known at the time as the war to end all wars. It was supposed to be like the war to make peace. So here's what Wilson's idea was. He had officially 14 separate points, and we've consolidated them into three basic themes. The first is to eliminate the causes of World War I. So when you go back to the causes of World War I, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. He's going to want to end the secret agreements. No more secret agreements, no more tangled alliances, no more secret, we'll all have your back if you have mine type things, right? Everything is going to be on the up and up. Everything is going to be out in the open. He also wants freedom of the seas. He wants militaries to be able to sail freely. He wants tradesmen and merchants to be able to sail freely, that no one's going to control different seas. So no more barricades and reducing the sinking of ships, things like that. To address the militarism, he wanted to limit the size of European militaries, particularly since they're all so close together. Reduce the size of their militaries, reduce the size of what was called their armaments or their weapon stockpiles. Between the 1880s and the 1910s, European countries were building up their militaries. Part of that was because of imperialism. As they were conquering other territories, they needed to have a military to protect these areas, like when you think about in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in East Asia. They needed these big militaries to protect their growing empires. The second theme or goal of Wilson's 14 points was to ensure what was called self-determination. Ethnic groups, when you think about the Slavic groups in South and Southeast Europe, they did not like that Austria-Hungary was either controlling them or encroaching on their political independence. Wilson said ethnic groups need to be able to control their own political destiny. They need to be able to control their own political future. He believed in these groups should have self-determination. And the biggest of his points was called creating a peacekeeping organization known as the League of Nations. So let's break that down a little bit. Wilson's League of Nations said that member organizations, member countries would sign a charter and join the League of Nations. That actually did make it into the Treaty of Versailles. Different member nations would agree to protect one another. They would respect one another's political boundaries and what's called their territorial integrity. They wouldn't encroach or they wouldn't attack one another, particularly if they shared borders. The League of Nations would also kind of create this collective peace. If all of these countries are a member of it, then together they could maintain the stability in Europe without having the larger this organization is, the more stability it has, and the more protection they have. It's important to note, even though the League of Nations makes it into the Treaty of Versailles, Germany is not invited to join the League of Nations. Germany and the rest of her allies in World War I were not invited to join. So let's break that down a little bit. The Europeans' vision of peace is going to be very, very different than the Americans. When you think geographically, and physical geography of particularly Eastern France that shares the border with Germany. What World War I and the digging of the trenches and the mortar shells and the battles, what does that do to the countryside, the farmland of France? It's devastating. And not just in the immediate time period, in the immediate future, but for centuries to come. Y'all, even still today, farmers are injured every year in eastern France by landmines that haven't been exploded all the way back to World War I. True story. So the big four at the Paris Peace Conference were President Woodrow Wilson, who's there on the far right. And coming to the left, then we're going to go backwards, we have David Lloyd George, who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Here we have Vittorio Orlando, who is the leader of Italy. And then here on the far left is Georges Clemenceau of France. These four were known as the Big Four that led most of the discussions and most of the arbitration of the Treaty of Versailles. France, because of its unique role of being kind of the host of the war, right? They hosted most of the western side of the war. Their goal was to weaken Germany. They never wanted to see a German tank again. They can just stay on that side and we don't want to see them. So they want to weaken Germany so that they can never threaten them again. And in response to that, the German army is going to be reduced to 100,000 men. That's tiny. That's really small for an army, for a country that size. 100,000 is very, very small. Great Britain says Germany has to acknowledge that they started the war. Wait a minute. Think back. Wasn't it Archduke Franz Ferdinand that was assassinated by the Black Hand? And Archduke Franz Ferdinand didn't represent Germany. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and then Russia. Germany wasn't involved in that. Well, they kind of were, but not directly. Germany was the only country left out of the big two or three, the only country left to blame this on. Austria-Hungary had fallen apart. Ottoman Empire is not around anymore. It was just Germany. They were the only country essentially left that could take any blame. It's important to know one of the big allies in World War I is not represented here. Who would that be? That's right, Russia. Russia, because they left the war early, had a separate peace treaty with Germany. Because of that, they were seen as outcasts, and they were not invited to this party. They did not get to come to the Paris Peace Conference. Now, the Treaty of Versailles is going to say that the treaty that they had signed with Germany is null and void, and the Paris Peace Conference is going to decide the terms of that surrender as well. Okay. In response to the fault of the war being on Germany, Germany is going to have to pay $33 billion in what were called war reparations to the Allies to offset the cost of the war. They said, you started it, you're going to have to pay me back for all that this war cost us, or part of what this war cost us. The United States was reluctant to agree to this, but the other three said, the United States is going to benefit from this financially because the American banks loaned a lot of money to both Britain and France in order to fund their participation in the war. So by making Germany pay them back, they would then be able to pay back the American banks. So it would financially benefit the United States. The United States did get some of the war reparations from Germany, in fact. Although they didn't pay continuously, there was a little pause in there for a while. Germany did finish paying off their war reparations in like the year 2005 or so fairly recently. Let's take a look at this political cartoon here. We're going to break it down using our OPTIC acronym. So, the overview. Just what do you see? What am I looking at? Well, I see a small person naked in a corner. Sounds like they might be crying because of the line drawings there. There's 4 older men walking out. They are formally dressed. Okay. P, the parts of the document. Let's break this down into different quadrants. So let's look at the top left quadrant. Okay, not much there. Top right, we see the faces of the men. Those faces kind of look familiar. That one with the mustache, that might be Vittoria Orlando. And that tall, skinny face, I remember Miss Ethel said, the tall, skinny face with the big nose, that's always Woodrow Wilson. The shorter man with the top hat in the front, that looks very British. I wonder if that's David Lloyd George. Okay. Titles, what words do I see? Let's start at the top. I see peace and future cannon fodder as the title. Fodder, cannon fodder, what's that? Oh, cannon fodder. That's like what they feed into the cannon. So future cannon ammunition, maybe? At the bottom, I see the words the tiger, and then in quotes, curious, I seem to hear a child weeping. I wonder if one of these politicians' nicknames is the tiger, because one of these people here is saying this because it's in quotes. At the bottom of that column, I see something that says peace treaty. And then above the naked child, I see 1940 class. Well, I wonder if that's their high school graduating class or college or, This political cartoon has something to say, the conclusion is, it has something to say about the peace treaty down there at the bottom is making this child, who's the class of 1940, cry. And these four politicians all had something to do with it. Okay. If you're familiar with our American government system, you know that President Woodrow Wilson did not get to actually sign the peace treaty. President Wilson, or our American presidents, don't declare war, and they don't determine the terms of peace either. That's the job of our legislature. So President Wilson had to bring this home to Congress for them to approve it. There were three separate groups in Congress that are going to have three very different views on this. The first is the reservationists, the people that said, the Treaty of Versailles, I like it, but I've got some reservations. I'd like to see a few changes, and then I would approve it. The reservationists. The irreconcilables. Absolutely not. I cannot reconcile myself. I cannot agree with the Treaty of Versailles. Absolutely no vote. No part of this is okay. Irreconcilable. And finally is the internationalists. Yeah, I agree with this treaty. Let's side with the rest of the world. Let's be very international, and I agree with this treaty. Well, the three sides didn't come together. And the 1920 election, the presidential election of 1920, ends up becoming a referendum on this treaty. Think back to last unit, referendum. That means the voters get to decide on it. So the Democrats, this is a presidential election, the Democrats are going to nominate James Cox, and the Republicans' nominee is Warren Harding. The Republican Warren Harding wins in a landslide. And with his coattails coming in, the Congress will have more Republicans, which is going to kill the Treaty of Versailles. The United States does not sign the Treaty of Versailles. The United States does not sign the Treaty of Versailles. We do not agree to those terms. Because of that, we also do not join the League of Nations. Y'all, this was Woodrow Wilson's brainchild. This was his little baby that he brought to the meeting, and we didn't join it. In 1921, the United States will sign a separate peace treaty with Germany and her allies, whoever was left. So from here going forward, we have this peace treaty that not all of the world signed, not everyone respected. Germany was laden with having to bear the blame for the war, which they didn't feel like they actually started. They didn't feel like that was a fair blame for them to carry. And then we've got a political system now that says we are not going to be involved in any more wars. We got involved in that war. It was kind of a mistake. It was a fluke. We are back to being independent. We're going to stay isolated. We're going to stay out of these international conflicts again. So let's see how that's going to affect us in the future.